Module is on the exit timeline. And by going through the timeline, it's going to also illuminate the process. It's going to talk about the individual steps in an optimum exit. Not one of these accidental exits, not one of these single bidder, uncontested, but in the way that it should work, the timeline. You know, a lot of times in the exits that I've looked back on, it's been when the group and I first start the conversation, a lot of times it seems that the most important question is not how much can we get, but how soon can we get this deal done. So in a lot of cases, it's interesting, the driver seems to be the timing more than the value. And the short answer to the question of how long is 6 to 18 months. And that's, I think, measured from the time that you engage the professionals. Not the time you start wishing about it, but the time you actually start putting resources on the project. And until the cash is in the bank. And it can take longer if the company is not ready, or if there's something that needs to be fixed before the company can be sold, or whether the financials need to be improved. And one of the other dirty secrets is you want to watch out for professionals that say they can do it faster. There's a certain amount of work that has to be done, and there are people out there that will promise you that they can make it happen, but it's really more of a sales pitch. One of the dirty secrets to watch out for. So there's a group of things that have to be done, or should be done, I should say, before you start to talk to the buyers. And this is one of the reasons why this process has to be done from the company side proactively and not reactively in response to an incoming buyer. Because about a quarter of the work should be done before you even have the first conversation. And this is first, as I said earlier, building alignment around that exit strategy so that you know that the team has a common goal, and that you also know that when you get to the end, you're going to get a yes from the people that have the right to make the decision in the company. The financial history and projections have to be cleaned up and properly built in a way that has credibility. You've got to create all of the sales collateral, because really this is a sales process. And there's a certain amount of information that you have to have available to be ready to respond in a professional way to a buyer so that they'll know that you're serious. There's often, way too often, a lot of work that has to be done to clean up the corporate structure. A lot of times before the angels get involved, sometimes after the angels get involved, and to be honest, sometimes because the angels got involved, there are things that aren't right in the corporate structure that have to be fixed before you can be ready to have a serious conversation about a transaction. And then you've got to go through and prepare all of the due diligence. You've got to prepare all the information that every buyer is going to want to see before they complete a transaction. And the reason that's there before you start talking to buyers is that if anything positive happens, if it goes at all well, you're not going to have the time to do number 5 later. You've got to get it done before you start to talk to buyers, because once that process starts, the stress on the management team will be so significant that they won't be able to get that work done after the fact. This first stage can take anywhere between 1 and 5 months. And really, really, as strongly as I can say it, please get all of this done before any conversations start with buyers. Any questions on that part 1, first 1 to 5 months?
What are you including in
Due diligence is a long list of items. And I've got some sample due diligence lists, and they usually run a couple hundred items. And they're built by law firms. And the law firms are almost always engaged by the buyers to do the due diligence. And they're almost always being paid by the hour. So you can imagine if you said to a group of lawyers, you're understanding already. So we want to make sure there's nothing bad here. And they're lawyers, so they're really good at making sure nothing bad. And then they're getting paid by the hour. It's a long list. And it's such a long list that we actually don't show it to the entrepreneurs all at once because we're afraid they might have a cardiac arrest or something, because they want to know everything. I mean, they want all the material contracts, they want all the employment agreements, they want all of the corporate documents, they want all of the tax returns, they basically want everything that they might want to know about this company, all electronic, all organized in a secure data share. And it's a predictable part of the process, but I've seen transactions actually fail just because number 5 wasn't done. And the reason you can actually blow the whole transaction is that the buyers are actually a pretty predictable type of organization, and they're going to all want the same information. And if when they start to ask for it, it's not there, and the entrepreneur starts scrambling around to prepare it, number one, the buyers think, this isn't what we thought it was. This doesn't sound like a very well-run company. It doesn't have all this obvious information. Well, it's obvious to them because they're big corporations. It's not obvious to entrepreneurs. But then what happens is time drags on. And time is the enemy of the seller. Because what happens is the buyers will get distracted by another opportunity. So a lot of times, if you haven't done this 1 to 5 months and you start doing it while the buyer is there and while the entrepreneurs are still trying to run the company, so much time will elapse, you'll actually blow the entire transaction just because the buyer will wander away by being distracted by something else.
What do you tend to mean by corporate structure?
A lot of times in corporate structure, there are things that are built into either the shareholders' agreements or built into the cap tables that make it impossible to get a transaction done. For example, multiple classes of shares can be really problematic. A lot of times when multiple share classes are created without really thinking about the exit, and then when you realize that in the absence of anything else to the contrary, most jurisdictions will say that to actually affect a transaction, you need to have a vote by class. So if you have, let's say, just a couple of people or one person that has a certain class of share, they would in effect have a veto. So you get into a situation where just because of the corporate structure, it's unlikely you're going to get an approval. That's one example. Other times we've seen structures that are so badly flawed, structures built by lawyers that are so badly flawed, you wouldn't know how to pay out the proceeds. There's flaws in how the cap table was built, how the option plan was built. There might be something that, when you really get into it, even though a lawyer did it, it's so badly flawed that it means if you did sell it, you wouldn't be able to distribute the proceeds, as an example. But the decision-making process is the one that I see most often needs work. It's a pretty simple thing to imagine that if you have an offer, I think it's obvious that you should have a majority vote. If most of the people want to sell it, most of the shares wanted to sell the company, it should be sold. Simple. But it's very often not the case. Different jurisdictions have very different decision-making processes. Very often there's a supermajority required to sell, let's say, the assets instead of the shares. Was never thought about by the lawyer that started the company. The articles, the constating documents were off the shelf from 50 years old documents, and when you really think about what could happen in a modern transaction, you need to change things. And a lot of times if you need to change them, you might have to do a shareholder vote. And that can be really difficult because it means you've got to go out, you've got to have a special meeting of the shareholders, extraordinary meeting of the shareholders. That needs a notice period. There's a lot of things that you don't want to be doing in the context of actually trying to get a transaction approved, that companies just kind of accumulate junk, detritus in their corporate structures over time that needs to be fixed before you start to get serious with the buyer. Any other questions?
What would you include in the sales collateral?
The sales collateral is a pretty predictable package of information. It always includes an executive summary, some amount of information that can be conveyed without a non-disclosure agreement, usually a one-page summary. Then you're going to also need a confidential information memorandum, which is a fancy word for a business plan with a little bit of legal stuff at the beginning and the end. And what that is it's a document that is always conveyed under a non-disclosure agreement, but it's what the people on the buy side would expect to see sometimes before they even have a phone call. Sometimes they're going to want to read this 20-page summary document before they decide whether they're even going to schedule a call. Because they're so busy. There's so many people phoning, like Google, for example. You know, they probably get a few hundred unsolicited offers to buy companies a day. And so what they'll do is they'll look at these executive summaries, they'll decide if they're interesting, then they'll have a conversation just about the non-disclosure agreement. Like, you know, they'll have a very short conversation, they'll want to sign an NDA, then they'll want to read the book, as it's called in that part of the industry. And then if it's interesting, then they'll want to have a phone call. And it is possible to get the conversation going in another way, but what you want to do if you're going to do this is you want to do it the way that they want to be interacted with. That's how they want to be interacted with.
So is it similar to the elements we might see in a pitch deck?
It's similar to a pitch deck. A little bit more information though. It's more like a business plan with some additional information. So 1 to 5 months depending on the company. The second part is the sales funnel. And again, this process of selling a company is just like any other sale. And the first thing that you've got to start with when you think about doing this, and again, for a fully marketed transaction where you want to end up with the best result, is you start to do research. And one of the things that is actually quite fascinating about this first research process is that I'd say in about 3/4 of the cases, the company that ends up buying a business was not known to the sellers before the fact. And this is kind of a revelation to entrepreneurs because they always view these transactions from the perspective of the market in which they're operating. And so they'll always have a list of people who might buy them. And that's good that they do. But the universe of potential acquirers is always much larger than the business people in the business appreciate, because the most common reason that people acquire is to get into a business. And it's actually quite rare that a competitor acquires a company. And the reason that competitors are less likely is they've already got a business just like that one. And they probably like it, and it's probably doing okay. And if they had 2 product lines, it would actually be kind of a pain to think about, you know, what to do with the second one. So, you know, the people that we automatically think about are actually not most often the people that end up acquiring. And so when you really start to think about the strategic value of the business, you've got to think much more horizontally than most people in the business do. You've got to think about people who aren't in this business, but perhaps want to be, or perhaps are thinking about it but haven't announced it yet, because corporations are very guarded about their corporate strategies, very guarded about their own product pipelines. And so you've really got to do some creative thinking in number 2 there to think about where the value might be greater. To think about, you know, who would really want to own this business. And this has to be done on a global perspective. A lot of times people will think about their own country. Here in America, for example, it's such a big economy that you can easily imagine all kinds of buyers, and you see all these transactions just happening within this one country. But that's only 5% of the world's population. And there's enormous economies outside of North America that are extraordinarily active right now in buying US-based companies. And everywhere else in the world, there is a global market for M&A. Anybody who buys companies doesn't care at all where they are in the world. When you're buying something that's going to cost tens of millions of dollars, it doesn't matter whether it's in, you know, Sunnyvale, California, Edinburgh, Scotland, or some city in China that you can't even pronounce. It really doesn't matter. Either way, buying and selling, it's a global market. And so when you do all of this and you think about it, most of the time, after you've done the research, you might start off with a few thousand suspects. you would work that down to maybe trying to make initial contacts with 50 to 250 companies. This is what it means to sell a company well. This is what it means to have a fully marketed transaction. And you're starting to see how different this is than waiting for somebody to come and knock on the door and buy the company. And a lot of entrepreneurs will swear that there aren't 50 companies in the world that might want to buy them. And that's okay, but they're wrong. For almost any saleable company, 50 is kind of a minimum realistic number. If you can't see 50, either it's so specialized, like maybe if you're making like the optics for radio telescopes, maybe there aren't 50 buyers. But for 98% of companies, 50 is kind of a practical minimum. 250 is kind of a practical maximum. Because if you start to think about contacting 250 companies, you need, a sales team of several people to do that. And then when you do contact 50 to 250, what will happen is that you'll get 10 to 50 that are interested. And 10 to 50 is the number of people that will sign a non-disclosure agreement. That's a big step in the exit process. That's the first kind of qualification process in the sales funnel. So several thousand suspects, 50 to 250 prospects, 10 to 50 that go through the qualification process to get to the point of a non-disclosure agreement, and then negotiate the non-disclosure agreement. That in itself, you could have a whole hour-long course on just strategy and tactics to get the NDA signed, because today, when you're trying to get an NDA signed, it goes back to the lawyers, let's say about half the time. So half the time, the business people cannot resolve the conflicts, and you need to get the lawyers involved, just so that you can send the information about the company. And if you're not doing that, if you're sending out NDAs and you're just getting signed, that's a bad sign. That means you're not protecting the company's assets adequately, because the market is not very uniform. So an NDA that works well in Silicon Valley might not even work in Boston. And when you start to think about the whole world, there will be differences of opinion as to what is appropriate to have in a non-disclosure agreement. And very often it means, just to get those NDAs signed, think about 2 or 3 man-months of work just to get the NDAs done. And then what will happen is you'll see about 5 to 8, roughly 5 to 8 will start due diligence. They'll want to get in deeper. They'll want to start to go through the information in that data share. And then if everything has been designed and executed well through that sales process, you'll end up with an ideal short list of 3. And I feel very strongly that it's 3. And I'll often have pretty fun conversations with people who sell businesses for a living, and they'll say, we always do 4. I don't believe any management team can handle 4. And other people think that 3 is too many and that 2 is a practical maximum. I've seen situations where you had 2, you thought both of them were going to be likely, end of the day they're both gone. So I don't think 2 provides enough redundancy. I think 3 is the optimum. And so, even that is something that there's controversy about. There's no data, but that's my opinion. 3 is what you want to go into the final bidding process with if you want to get to that 75 or 80% probability of success, and to make sure that the shareholders are getting the best possible result. That'll take 2 to 6 months to do that if you adequately resource it. This is about 3 people's work for that 2 to 6 months.
Question. Okay. So how the initial contact with you to make a company? What do you mean by initial contact? So what do you present? What do you send to them? What's the details?
Good question. So the initial contact would be getting that 1-page executive summary to them. And most of the time, it also is a conversation. So about half the time, it'll be a conversation as well as the 1-page summary. The summary tells them what you've got. Introduces enough to maybe get them on the phone. It also is enough information. They may just email back and say, not interested, doesn't fit our corporate strategy. So it's a combination of phone and email. It takes 5 to 7 attempts to get that conversation going on average. So if you start doing the math on 250 companies, typically 2 or 3 people in those companies that you're trying to contact, 5 to 7 attempts, you can see why it takes roughly 3 people through that period to make that number of contacts to get that process started. Sir?
That sounds like it could fit a mature company or a large company going to the process as well. Is there anything that you said is vary for the stage of the company or the size of the company that applies to all businesses?
This would apply to, I would say, any company that's saleable. So, if it was an acqui-hire, like let's say what we were dealing with was a failed angel investment and the team wanted to find a place to be employed, you might not do this. But if it was a company that had value, then I think, and it's got to be able to economically do this, the value has to be more than $10 million. You cannot afford to do this if the transaction is below that value, but then you really are into the acqui-hire. Anything that has value, I think 10 million is kind of a minimal valuation that makes sense. And part of the reason for that is that the buyers won't be interested if it's worth less than 10 million. So even in a smaller size buyer, if you tell them you've got a company that's worth 5 million, they don't think, oh, it's a bargain, we should look at it. They think it's not really worth looking at because there's a certain amount of work that they have to do to acquire, and 10 is where it starts to get harder. But for a $10 million company, yes. Ma'am?
Any secret how to get into those initial contacts?
No, it's actually not that difficult if you know how to do it. These buyers are actually pretty good about letting people know that they're interested in acquiring. That's their business. So, in corporate buyers, for example, they have whole divisions, which they call corporate development, whose job it is to attract potential companies to be acquired, to evaluate companies to be acquired, and then to acquire them. So that's their job function. That's their only function. And so if you know how to speak to them, they're actually pretty easy to speak to.
So how much of this is being done by the bankers that you've hired versus this company?
We're getting to that, but I'm sort of building up to why it's probably being done by the bankers, because it's very hard to do this with people inside the corporation. I'm going to get to that module after this one.
Can you comment on the risk of pitching to a potential acquirer who's also a potential customer? And do they have that firewall internally? And if you can tune it at all, if you can, with the life sciences, that would be helpful for me.
First of all, life sciences is not really different from tech. Back when I was a venture capitalist, we used to segment our teams. We had life science teams and we had IT teams. We thought it's a totally different investment world. That was true 15 or 20 years ago. What's interesting is life science was just actually slow to develop. And today, the dynamics of M&A in life science are identical to what they are in IT, which is fascinating. For me, this is my whole world, fascinating development. And really what's happened is in life sciences, the big pharmas especially have just laid off their development staff. They've given up on R&D in essence. They acquire the same way that they do in tech now. It's really an interesting development. But let me not get sidetracked. Your question, which is an excellent one, is how do you decide how much to disclose to a customer? And there's no easy answer to that. You've got to look at each case. And the disclosure of this information, which I haven't really drilled into, is always done in layers. You start with this one-page executive summary that you'd be happy for anybody to see. Because once you start emailing that out to 200 people, you might as well put it on the internet. And so that has to be, again, carefully thought out in each case as to what information and at what stage you're going to disclose it. And there is risk. And there's some risk that you just can't mitigate. There's going to be more people knowing more about your company by going through this process. And you can't kind of do it tentatively. You almost have to decide, we are selling this company. We are going to run this process. We're going to protect the information as well as it can be protected. But we aren't going to be the owners at the end.
I'm hearing, but on the subtext is you have to assume that there's not a reliable firewall between the M&A team, whatever that may look like in a company, and the purchasers, the buyers
Yes.
of that customer.
It's actually much worse than that. You have to assume that the information you give them is going into their product development team at the same time.
Right, for advice, input, guidance. Yeah. Okay.
I'm going to tell you a story near the end
Okay.
that really illustrates how treacherous it actually is.
So, I mean, I think I saw a slide. When do you tell the team? I mean, that kind of before you reach out to people, it's the implication. We'll get to it. I'm sure.
So 2 to 6 months, building the sales funnel, qualifying the prospects, getting down to a short list. The third phase, the bidding process, is what happens with those three. And these three will be in due diligence. They're going to be actively negotiating simultaneously. That's what all this work has been designed to do. And the CEO at this stage is going to be fully engaged and the limiting factor in the process. And this will take 2 to 4 months to properly work with these buyers, to see how much they will actually bid, and to get the best result. And I'll tell you a story in the case studies about how that was done in one case, how it was done well in one case. And then once there's a signed agreement, which is usually called a letter of intent, it can still take months for the board, shareholders, M&A professionals, lawyers, tax advisors to agree on what they call the definitive agreements. And this can be a stack of paper that when you actually see it for signing, sometimes it's like, this kind of height of paper by the time the lawyers have gotten done with it. The actual purchase agreement might only be 75 or 100 pages, but by the time you get through everything else, it can literally be, it's going to be a stack. And they'll spread it out on a table in the old days. Today it'll be like an almost endless number of DocuSign documents that everybody has to sign. And then you've got to go through, it's not just the stakeholders, you've got to get boards, shareholders, even regulators. Even for a $10 or $20 million transaction, you often end up needing to get a Hart-Scott filing, is what they call it here in America. Each country has their own different description of a government approval for a surprisingly large percentage of transactions. In that phase, which is the most difficult from an emotional perspective, because you have a deal, you're just waiting for everybody to sign the paper, 1 to 3 months. And that's why when you add all these things up, it's a 6 to 18 month process between making the decision, resourcing the process, hiring the team, and actually getting the cash in the bank. And to the question of when to tell the team, this is always a difficult thing, and there's no universal answer. A lot of CEOs think that there's going to be an employee impact. Other CEOs think that it's none of the employees' business. Why would we tell the employees that we're selling the company? But one of the things that I'm surprised at how many CEOs don't appreciate is how efficient their internal grapevine is. We live in this whole new social media world, or at least our kids do, and information these days moves faster than it ever has before. And I think that it's naive, even in a medium-sized company, to think that you can keep it secret once this process starts. So I don't think it's a question of whether you're going to tell the employees. I think it's only a question of when. And my belief is it's better to tell people early, because there will be an impact. There will be anxiety created. I think it's better to work through that and let it dissipate rather than have the team in a state of shock because the buyers have showed up to do the due diligence. And because that itself can both impact their perception and also the corporate performance. And the last thing you want to have is the company starting to falter at the worst possible time as you're going through that fourth phase. You're doing all the documentation. The buyers will be looking at every metric there is to just keep themselves convinced that they want to do this. So the impact of this is not to be underestimated. A very significant factor in all this, which leads up to the question of do you need a banker, is CEO deal fatigue. And it's really hard to describe what this is like to someone who hasn't seen it a number of times. And this is an incredibly intense and stressful process, especially for the CEO. And even the toughest CEOs can be completely incapacitated by this process. And just to give you an example, I had a situation where a CEO, where I was a director, if you could imagine kind of a 6-foot-something, 185-pound lean hockey-playing CEO, tough guy. You never ever could flap this guy. Well, during that last phase, part 4, we wheeled him out of the law firm's office in a stretcher on an ambulance. I thought we'd killed the guy. I thought he'd had a heart attack. But it was just stress. But I say just stress, and I mean, just imagine a 40-ish hockey-playing tough guy so incapacitated by the stress that we took him away in an ambulance. Now, he was actually fine shortly after that, but it just really solidified for me just how difficult this is. Very few CEOs will be sleeping well through the process. And this is months of grinding, months of negotiating. And so one of the things that you want in an experienced M&A advisor is just to do everything that's possible to keep that CEO in reserve for as long as possible, to offload that CEO as long as possible, because they're always the limiting factor, 100% of the time, and the weak point in getting the transaction done. Any questions on the timeline and the steps and how long it takes?
Question for you. You touched on building the sales pipeline and the importance of the research on prospects, and then also the building up of the strategic value after the process has kicked off. Can you comment a little bit about the value and the role you see that in building an exit strategy to begin with, and then the alignment portion of the process?
And of course, they all fit together. I mean, this is one business process from beginning to end. You've got to create that alignment. You've got to have that strategy to be able to execute on all the things that we're talking about today. And that's why, again, to do it right, you really got to start with the strategy. That's the foundation. But the plan and the execution is equally important. Did that answer?
So just specifically on the research of prospects, for instance, and the value, the strategic value to that set of prospects, that portion of the research, if you will, as you're building the strategy and building the alignment well before you kick off the process.
Well, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg there, because the research that we talked about, 2 to 6 calendar months for 3 people, it's expensive. You're talking about 6 man months to maybe 12 or 18 man months, and that's not junior people. That's senior professional people. And so, you can imagine what that value of that time is. So you kind of have to have the higher level strategy of, we're going to sell this company, and you have to have that commitment and that budget to do the research. So it's I guess a better way to say it would be that that's a secondary strategic part, which is looking at the strategic value and doing the research to find the best set of potential buyers in the world. And we're going to talk about how you find that strategic value a little bit later on in the workshop. Any other questions?